The fog rolled in just as the sun began to set, a thick, milky blanket that swallowed the forest whole. As a park ranger stationed at Black Hollow Reserve, I had seen fog before, but never like this. It moved unnaturally fast, creeping through the trees and cloaking the trails in an eerie stillness. It felt alive, almost predatory, and as I stood at the edge of the ranger station's porch, watching it crawl toward me, a sense of unease settled deep in my chest. My radio crackled to life. "Davis, we got a report of someone stranded on Ridgeway Trail," came the voice of my supervisor. "They say they can't see a thing in the fog. You're the closest. Can you check it out?" I hesitated, glancing at the dense white haze that had already consumed the parking lot. The idea of venturing into that felt wrong, but I couldn't leave someone out there alone. "On it," I replied, grabbing my flashlight and radio before heading out. The trail was barely visible under the fog, the usual landmarks obscured. My flashlight cut through the haze in a narrow beam, but it only illuminated a few feet ahead. The rest was an endless white void. The air was damp and cold, and every sound seemed muffled, as though the fog had absorbed the world. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely. "This is Ranger Davis. If you can hear me, call out so I can find you." No response came, but I thought I heard something faint, a rustling noise like footsteps on the trail ahead. I quickened my pace, the beam of my flashlight bouncing as I moved. "I'm here to help," I shouted again, hoping to hear a reply. Instead, the rustling grew louder, more deliberate, and it seemed to circle me. I stopped, turning in place, trying to locate the source of the sound. The fog pressed in tighter, and I felt an unsettling sensation, as though I were being watched. Then I saw it, a figure, shadowy and indistinct, standing just off the trail. It was too far to make out any details, but it was tall, its shape blurred by the fog. "Are you okay?" I called out, shining my flashlight toward it. The beam seemed to dissolve before it reached the figure, and for a moment I thought it was just my imagination. But then it moved. It stepped closer, slow and deliberate, and something about its gait made my stomach turn. It wasn't natural. It was jerky, almost puppet-like, as though it were struggling to control its own body. My hand tightened around the flashlight, and I took a cautious step back. "Stay where you are," I said, my voice firm but shaking. "I'm with the Park Service. If you're injured, I can help, but I need you to stop moving." The figure didn't stop. It came closer, and as it did, I realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't walking. It was gliding, its feet never touching the ground. My breath caught in my throat as its features came into focus. Its face was pale and hollow, its eyes empty voids that seemed to pull at my very soul. It tilted its head as if studying me, and its mouth opened in a soundless scream. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "This isn't real," I muttered to myself, trying to break the spell of fear that held me. "It's just the fog messing with me." But then the whispers started. Low and guttural, they surrounded me, growing louder with every passing second. I couldn't understand the words, but they filled my head, pushing out every rational thought. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at me, and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. I turned and ran. The trail was barely visible under my feet, the fog disorienting me as I stumbled over roots and rocks. The whispers followed, growing fainter but never entirely disappearing. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of the ranger station through the haze. Bursting through the door, I slammed it shut behind me and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. My supervisor rushed over, his face etched with concern. "What happened? Did you find them?" "There was no one," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "No one human." He didn't ask for clarification, just helped me to a chair and handed me a glass of water. I knew how crazy it would sound if I tried to explain what I had seen, so I kept the details to myself. But as I sat there trying to calm my nerves, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked, that whatever was in the fog had seen me, and it wasn't finished. The next day the fog lifted, and the forest returned to its usual calm. But Ridgeway Trail felt different. I avoided it as much as I could, and when I had to patrol it, I always made sure to finish before sunset. Whatever I encountered that night, it wasn't something natural. It was something old, something hungry, and I knew that if the fog ever rolled in again, I wouldn't be going back. The fog came in thick and fast, swallowing the forest in an impenetrable shroud. It was the kind of fog that seemed alive, curling around the trees and dampening every sound. As a park ranger stationed at Silvercrest Reserve, I had seen my fair share of eerie weather, but this was something else. It was unnatural, oppressive, and felt almost sentient. I was on the evening patrol when the first report came through. A hiker had called in, claiming to be lost on the North Ridge Trail. She said the fog had descended so quickly she couldn't find her way back, and the trail markers had disappeared in the murk. I grabbed my gear and set off, hoping to reach her before nightfall made the search even more dangerous. The North Ridge Trail was one of the park's longest and most remote paths, winding through dense forest and rocky outcrops. It was known for its stunning views, but tonight, those views were hidden behind a wall of white. My flashlight barely pierced the fog, the beams scattering into useless fragments. Every step felt heavier, the silence pressing down like a weight. "North Ridge Trail, this is Ranger Hale," I called into my radio. "I'm about half a mile in. Do we have a fix on the caller's location?" The reply crackled back, distorted by interference. "Last ping. Near the ridge. No visual." The static made it hard to hear, but I caught enough. She was near the ridge, about 2 miles ahead. I quickened my pace, the crunch of my boots the only sound in the unnerving stillness. The usual forest noises, chirping insects, rustling leaves, were absent, as if the fog had swallowed them too. About a mile in, I found the first sign of her. A water bottle lay abandoned on the trail, beads of condensation still clinging to the plastic. I picked it up, my stomach twisting with unease. "Found an item, likely hers," I said into the radio, but the response was drowned in static. I kept moving. The trail was barely discernible now, the fog erasing all familiar landmarks. Trees loomed out of the whiteness like towering phantoms, their gnarled branches reaching overhead. I thought I saw movement in the periphery of my vision, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. Just the fog, thick and unyielding. Then I heard it. A faint, wavering voice calling out, "Help! Over here!" The voice was distant but clear, and it didn't seem to come from the trail. I veered off the path, pushing through the underbrush, the sound growing louder with each step. "Ma'am, stay where you are," I shouted. "I'm coming to you." As I approached, the voice became distorted, almost echoing, as if it were bouncing off invisible walls. I broke into a clearing, and my flashlight illuminated something that made my blood run cold. There in the center was a figure. She stood motionless, her back to me, her form shrouded in the fog. "Ma'am?" I called, my voice shaking slightly. "Are you hurt?" She didn't respond, didn't even turn. I took a cautious step closer, and that's when I noticed the strange way she was standing. Unnaturally rigid, her head tilted at an odd angle. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, her figure seemed to shift, as if she were dissolving into the fog. "Are you okay?" I tried again, but my words felt hollow. Something about her presence was wrong, deeply wrong. The air around her seemed colder, heavier, and the fog swirled unnaturally, as if drawn to her. Then she turned. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow voids, dark and endless. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, my flashlight clattering to the ground. The beam flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows as the figure began to move toward me. It didn't walk, it glided, its movements unnervingly smooth. The guttural hum grew louder, joined by whispers that seemed to come from all directions. My radio crackled to life, but the words were incomprehensible, drowned in static and overlapping voices. Scrambling to my feet, I grabbed my flashlight and ran. Branches tore at my uniform, the fog seeming to thicken with every step. The whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent, until they were a deafening chorus. I didn't dare look back. When I finally burst onto the main trail, the fog began to thin. The voices faded and the oppressive cold lifted. Gasping for breath, I radioed for help, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Backup arrived 20 minutes later, and together we searched the area, but there was no sign of the figure or the missing hiker. The next morning, a search team found her backpack and phone near the ridge, but she was never seen again. The investigation was eventually closed, chalked up to a tragic accident. But I knew the truth. I had seen something out there, something that didn't belong. The fog hasn't returned to the park since that night, but I dread the day it does. Whatever was lurking in it, whatever I encountered, is still out there, waiting, and I'll never forget those empty eyes staring into my soul. Red Rock Canyon was known for its rugged beauty, with crimson cliffs towering over vast, arid stretches of desert. It was a place of serenity by day, a haven for hikers and climbers who marveled at the natural splendor. But by night, the canyon became something else entirely, silent, oppressive, and alive with shadows. As a park ranger stationed there for 3 years, I'd grown accustomed to its moods, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that summer night. It started with a missing camper. A solo hiker named Brent had checked in earlier that day, planning to traverse one of the canyon's more secluded trails. By dusk, his car was still in the lot and he hadn't returned. It wasn't unusual for hikers to misjudge their timing, so I set out to find him, armed with a flashlight, radio, and a growing sense of unease. The canyon was vast, its trails winding and steep. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the red rocks seemed to bleed into the shadows, their warm hues fading to cold, lifeless gray. The air was still, heavy with the scent of dry earth and sagebrush. My boots crunched on the gravel path, the sound unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent expanse. "Brent," I called, my voice echoing off the cliffs. "This is Ranger Cole. Are you out here?" No answer. The quiet felt wrong, too complete, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. I pushed on, following the trail deeper into the canyon. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it seemed feeble against the sheer walls that loomed on either side. About a mile in, I found his backpack. It was torn, the fabric shredded as if by claws. Scattered nearby were his water bottle and a trail map, both smeared with dirt. My stomach twisted. This wasn't the result of a simple fall or a wayward tumble down the rocky slopes. Something had attacked him. I radioed the station, my voice low but urgent. "I've found the hiker's pack. Looks like it was torn apart. I'm going to keep searching. Might need backup." Static crackled in response, the signal weak in the canyon's depths. I pressed on, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The trail grew narrower, the cliffs closing in like the walls of a maze. Every step felt heavier, the oppressive silence amplifying the sound of my own breathing. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, echoing through the canyon. It wasn't a coyote or a mountain lion. Those sounds I knew well. This was different, deeper, almost unnatural. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I scanned the darkness, the flashlight beam darting frantically over the rocks and scrub. "Brent?" I called again, though my voice faltered. "If you can hear me, call out." The growl came again, louder this time, closer. I turned sharply, the light catching movement on the ridge above me. A shadow, tall, angular, and wrong, slipped between the rocks, too fast for me to get a clear look. My heart raced as I backed away, my instincts screaming to leave. But I couldn't. Brent was still out there somewhere. I forced myself to move forward, my every step measured and cautious. The growl turned into a series of clicks and hisses, echoing from all directions. Whatever it wasn't trying to hide anymore. It wanted me to know it was there. The trail opened into a small clearing, the cliffs rising steeply on all sides. At the center, illuminated by the flashlight, was Brent. He was slumped against a boulder, his face pale, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His shirt was torn, his arms and legs covered in long, jagged scratches. "Brent!" I ran to him, kneeling beside him. His eyes fluttered open, wild with terror. "It's still here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's watching." Before I could respond, a sound like grinding stone filled the air. I looked up, and my blood ran cold. Perched on a rock above us was the creature. It was massive, its form vaguely humanoid but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was mottled, blending seamlessly with the red rock around it. But its eyes, yellow and unblinking, pierced through the darkness, locking onto me with a predatory focus. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it leaped, landing with a thud that shook the ground. I grabbed Brent, hauling him to his feet as the creature let out a deafening screech. Its movements were jerky yet swift, closing the distance between us in seconds. "Run!" I shouted, shoving Brent toward the trail. He stumbled but managed to move, his panic fueling his strength. I followed close behind, the creature's guttural growls echoing in my ears. The chase was a blur of terror and adrenaline. The creature stayed just out of reach, its claws scraping against the rocks as it pursued us. The flashlight beam bounced wildly, casting fleeting glimpses of its monstrous form. We burst onto the main trail, the parking lot visible in the distance. The creature stopped abruptly, its yellow eyes glaring at us from the shadows. It let out one final ear-piercing screech before retreating into the canyon. Brent collapsed by his car, shaking uncontrollably. I radioed for an ambulance, my own hands trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. The official report would list his injuries as the result of an animal attack, but I knew the truth. Something ancient and predatory lurks in Red Rock Canyon, and it's still out there waiting. The call came in just after dusk. A family camping near Blackstone Lake had reported strange noises coming from the woods. Voices, faint and overlapping, drifting out of the darkness. The father claimed they didn't sound human, but more like whispers carried on the wind. Normally I would have dismissed such reports as echoes or wildlife, but there was something in his voice that made me pause. He was scared, and genuine fear is hard to fake. Blackstone Lake was in one of the most remote sections of the park, accessible only by a long, winding dirt road that most visitors avoided. By the time I arrived, the family was already packing up their campsite, their faces pale in the glow of their lantern. The father approached me as I stepped out of my truck, his movements jittery. "We're leaving," he said quickly. "I don't care about the fee. Keep it. We just need to get out of here." I tried to calm him down, asking for details. He described the noises, soft, insistent whispers that grew louder the closer they got to the edge of the lake. He said it felt like they were being watched. I offered to escort them out, but he shook his head, insisting they'd be fine as long as they left immediately. With that, they piled into their car and disappeared down the road. I stood there for a moment, the weight of the forest pressing in around me. The night was unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of crickets and frogs conspicuously absent. Pulling out my flashlight, I decided to investigate. The trail to the lake was narrow, flanked by dense trees that seemed to close in as I walked. My boots crunched against the dirt path, the sound magnified in the stillness. The air grew cooler as I approached the water, a damp chill that seemed to seep into my skin. When I reached the lake, I understood why the family had been so unsettled. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of black glass. But it wasn't just the eerie calm that caught my attention. It was the sound. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, but growing louder with every step I took toward the shoreline. Whispers. They weren't coming from the woods as the family had claimed, but from the lake itself. I stood frozen, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the water. There was no movement, no sign of life, yet the voices continued, overlapping and indistinct. It was as if the lake itself was speaking, but in a language I couldn't understand. My instinct was to leave, to call it in and let someone else handle it. But I couldn't. Something compelled me to stay, to listen. I stepped closer to the edge of the water, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to surround me. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice sounding small against the cacophony of murmurs. The whispers paused, just for a moment, and then resumed, louder and more frantic. Suddenly the surface of the lake rippled, not like a breeze or a fish breaking the surface, but as if something massive was moving beneath the water. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, I thought I saw shapes, faces distorted and shifting, staring up at me from beneath the surface. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The whispers turned into a low hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my chest. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, as though the very earth was responding to the lake's call. And then I saw it. A figure rose from the water, its form half submerged and cloaked in shadow. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like a predator in the dark. It stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. I backed away, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the radio on my belt. "This is Ranger Holt at Blackstone Lake," I said, my voice trembling. "I need backup immediately. There's something here." Before I could finish, the figure tilted its head as if studying me. Then it moved, gliding across the water with impossible speed. I turned and ran, the sound of the whispers now a deafening roar in my ears. The trees blurred past me as I sprinted back to my truck, not daring to look back. When I reached the vehicle, I slammed the door shut and started the engine, my hands trembling so badly it took 2 tries to turn the key. As I sped down the dirt road, the whispers faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next day, omitting the more supernatural details. A search team was sent to the lake, but they found nothing unusual, no signs of the figure, no strange noises. The official report chalked it up to a combination of exhaustion and overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that whatever is in Blackstone Lake isn't bound by the rules of nature. It's something older, something darker, and it's still there, waiting beneath the surface. The woods always had a way of feeling alive, but not in the comforting, vibrant way that most visitors described. To me, the forest was full of secrets, the kind that stayed hidden beneath the canopy of ancient pines and in the dark corners of forgotten trails. As a park ranger at Crescent Ridge, I had seen things I couldn't explain. Strange lights in the distance, sounds that didn't belong to any animal I knew. But nothing compared to the night I first encountered the Watcher. It began with a missing person report. A solo hiker, a man in his late 30s, hadn't returned from his day hike. His car was still in the lot, and his permit showed he'd planned to take the Ridgeway Loop Trail, a winding path that cut deep into the oldest part of the forest. It was a trail that even the most experienced hikers treated with caution, especially near dusk. I set out just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. The fading light turned the forest a deep shade of amber, but as I moved further into the trail, that warm glow disappeared, swallowed by the dense trees. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the path and the occasional rustling of leaves above. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, as though the forest were holding its breath. About an hour into my search, I found the first clue: a water bottle, half empty and lying just off the trail. It was dusty, but recent. I radioed the station, letting them know I'd found something, and pressed on. The air grew colder as I climbed higher, the trees thicker and more oppressive. My flashlight beam felt feeble against the encroaching darkness. Then I heard it, a sound that made me stop in my tracks. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. A low, humming chant drifting through the trees. It wasn't a song, exactly, but a series of deep, guttural tones rising and falling like a primal ritual. My pulse quickened as I scanned the forest with my flashlight, searching for the source. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. "This is Ranger Holt. If you're out here, I'm here to help." No response. I took a cautious step forward, my hand resting on the radio at my belt. That's when I saw it. Movement in the trees. At first it was just a shadow, barely visible in the dim light. But then it stepped closer, and I realized it wasn't a person. The figure was tall, impossibly so, its thin, elongated form blending almost seamlessly with the surrounding trees. It had no discernible face, just a featureless head that tilted as if studying me. Its arms were long, ending in fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally, curling around the trunk of a tree as it leaned forward. My breath caught in my throat as it took another step, its movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette being manipulated by an unseen hand. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The figure stopped, its head tilting again, as if deciding what to do next. I reached for my radio, my fingers fumbling as I tried to call for backup. "Station, This is Holt. I need assistance on Ridgeway Trail. There's something out here. My voice cracked, and the static-filled response was barely audible. The figure moved again, faster this time, its body contorting as it glided between the trees. I turned and ran, the chanting starting again, louder now, surrounding me. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping in a dissonant chorus. The sound made my head spin, disorienting me as I tore down the trail, branches slashing at my arms and face. I didn't stop until I reached a small clearing, gasping for air. The chanting had stopped, but I still felt it, an oppressive presence watching from just beyond the tree line. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the clearing. It raised one long, spindly arm, pointing at me, its faceless head tilting in that same unsettling way. Then it was gone. When I finally made it back to the station, my supervisor was waiting. He took one look at me, scratched, pale, and trembling, and didn't ask questions. I filed a vague report, claiming I had found no sign of the missing hiker and that I'd been disoriented by the terrain. The man was never found. His disappearance was chalked up to an unfortunate accident, but I knew better. The Watcher of Crescent Ridge wasn't a story or a trick of the mind. It was real, and it was still out there, watching, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander too far into its domain. Since that night, I've avoided Ridgeway Trail. The forest doesn't feel the same anymore, and when I'm alone in the park, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Some things in the wild aren't meant to be understood, and the Watcher is one of them. The night was unusually calm at Silver Pine Reserve. The air was heavy with the scent of pine, and the still waters of Whispering Lake reflected the crescent moon like a mirror. As a park ranger, I was used to patrolling the trails after dark, ensuring no stragglers had lingered past the park's closing hours. Whispering Lake was my last stop for the night, a quiet and serene spot that rarely drew attention. But that night, the air felt wrong, heavy, almost suffocating. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a hiker's report earlier that day. A man had approached the ranger station, pale and visibly shaken, claiming he'd heard a woman screaming near the lake. He said the sound seemed to come from the water itself, echoing across the surface. Despite searching the area, he found no one and had left in a hurry, refusing to camp anywhere near the lake. I dismissed it as his imagination, but as I approached the lake now, alone under the moonlight, his story crept back into my mind. The water was unnervingly still, not a ripple disturbing the surface. I scanned the shoreline with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the starlight. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, were absent, leaving only an eerie silence. I called out, my voice echoing faintly across the lake. "Park Service, is anyone out here?" My words were met with silence, but then faintly, I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It started as a low moan, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, transforming into a piercing scream that seemed to come from the center of the lake. The sound was raw, filled with anguish, and impossibly human. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I scanned the water, searching for the source. The scream echoed again, louder this time, and the surface of the lake began to ripple as though something large was moving beneath it. I took a step back, my boots crunching against the gravel shore. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but my duty kept me rooted to the spot. I had to know what was happening. "Hello?" I called again, my voice faltering. "Do you need help?" The water rippled more violently, and for a moment I thought I saw something. An indistinct shape just beneath the surface, too large to be any fish native to the lake. The scream came again, louder and more guttural, and this time it was accompanied by a chilling sound. Whispers. They were faint, overlapping, and unintelligible, but they seemed to come from all directions, carried on a non-existent breeze. I stepped back again, my flashlight beam darting across the lake, and then, in the middle of the water, I saw her, a figure, barely visible, standing waist-deep in the lake. Her hair was long and dark, clinging to her face and shoulders as though she'd just risen from the depths. Her skin was pale, almost glowing under the moonlight, and her eyes were fixed on me. "Are you okay?" I managed to ask, though my voice cracked with fear. She didn't respond. Instead, she raised a hand, beckoning me with a slow, deliberate motion. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and I realized they were coming from her. Her lips didn't move, but the voices echoed from her direction, a cacophony of anguish and desperation. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the beam illuminated her face. It was wrong. Her features were sunken, her mouth unnaturally wide, and her eyes, they were empty, dark voids that seemed to pull at my very soul. I stumbled back, the light shaking wildly as the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The water surged and the figure began to move toward the shore, gliding unnaturally across the surface. I turned and ran, my heart pounding as the screams and whispers chased me. The forest seemed to close in around me, the path twisting and turning in ways it never had before. My flashlight died completely, plunging me into darkness. I ran blindly, the sound of splashing water and guttural cries following me until I burst onto the main trail. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the faint rustle of leaves. I collapsed against a tree, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the radio on my belt. "This is Ranger Hale," I gasped. "Something's wrong at Whispering Lake. I need backup immediately." When the backup team arrived, the lake was calm once more, its surface unbroken and serene. There was no sign of the figure, no sound of whispers or screams. My report was met with skepticism, but I knew what I had seen. Something ancient and malevolent lurked beneath the waters of Whispering Lake, and it was only waiting for its next visitor. I never patrolled that area again after dark. The lake still sits there, silent and still. But I know the truth. It isn't silent. It isn't still. And when the moon rises and the fog rolls in, it screams. The campsite had been abandoned for years, tucked deep into a remote corner of the park that few dared to venture into. Officially, it was closed due to erosion and unsafe conditions, but every ranger knew there was more to it than that. Stories circulated about hikers who vanished there, whispers of strange lights, and the feeling of being watched. Most dismissed the tales as nothing more than local legends, but there was a reason even the bravest campers avoided it. They called it the Forgotten Campsite. I was the newest ranger at Ridgeway National Park, and the tales of the campsite intrigued me more than they scared me. When I overheard my supervisor mentioning a report of trespassers in the area, I volunteered to check it out. The look he gave me was unreadable, half warning, half pity, but he nodded and handed me the assignment. The hike to the Forgotten Campsite was long and arduous, the trail barely maintained. Overgrowth swallowed most of the path, and the deeper I went, the darker it seemed to get, even though it was barely past midday. The air felt heavy, and the usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, were muted, as if the place were holding its breath. When I arrived, the campsite looked like any other. Fire pits sat empty and overgrown, the remains of wooden picnic tables rotting under a thick layer of moss. It was eerily quiet. I scanned the area, calling out to see if anyone was there. My voice seemed to be swallowed by the surrounding trees. Then I saw it, evidence of recent activity. A small tent stood in the middle of the clearing, its fabric taut and pristine. Nearby, a makeshift clothesline was strung between two trees, a pair of damp socks swaying gently in the breeze. Someone had definitely been here. "Park Service," I called out. "This area is closed. If you're here, you need to pack up and leave immediately." There was no response. I approached the tent cautiously, my hand resting on the radio at my belt. The flap was slightly open, and I could see a sleeping bag inside, neatly rolled. But there was no sign of the camper. I circled the clearing looking for any other clues. A trail, footprints, anything that might lead me to whoever was here. That's when I noticed the shadows. At first, I thought it was just the shifting light through the trees, but something about them wasn't right. They moved independently, stretching and shrinking in ways that didn't match the position of the sun. One shadow in particular caught my eye. It was long and humanoid, but there was no one there to cast it. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped back toward the tent. The shadow moved, sliding across the ground unnaturally fast, disappearing into the tree line. My heart pounded as I scanned the forest, gripping my flashlight even though it was still daylight. The shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision, darting between the trees like they were alive. I radioed the station, my voice trembling. I'm at the forgotten campsite. There's no sign of the camper, but something's not right here. Requesting backup. Static crackled on the other end, followed by a faint, distorted voice I couldn't understand. The interference was heavy, and I wasn't sure if my message had gone through. I tried again, but the radio only hissed in response. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl coming from the direction of the tent. I turned, my flashlight beam slicing through the dim light, and froze. The shadow was back, standing upright now, tall and impossibly thin. It didn't move, but I could feel its attention on me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. "Who's there?" I shouted, though my voice cracked. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't need to. It began to elongate, stretching across the clearing toward me, its edges flickering like smoke. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the uneven ground. The shadows seemed to follow, twisting and writhing in the corners of my vision. The forest felt alive with their presence, every tree and rock casting shapes that shouldn't exist. By the time I reached the main trail, the sun was setting, and the shadows receded into the growing darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, slamming the door and locking it behind me as if that could keep them out. My hands trembled as I radioed the station again, this time managing to get through. When backup arrived, the campsite was empty. The tent, the clothesline, even the fire pits were gone, as if they had never existed. The forest looked untouched, but I knew what I had seen. The forgotten campsite wasn't just abandoned. It was claimed, haunted by something that thrived in the darkness. Whatever lived in those shadows wasn't human, and it wasn't meant to be disturbed. I never went back, and I warned every new ranger to stay away. Some places are better left forgotten,